Hashtag the frozen stand, when 300 held the line against 10,000. January 17th, 1940. Eastern Finland. The Karelon Isthmus. The thermometer reads -42 degrees Celsius. In this kind of cold, steel shatters like glass. Breath crystallizes before it leaves the mouth. The pine forests stand silent, branches weighted with snow so thick they bow toward the earth like mourners at a grave. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls, a sound that carries for kilometers across the frozen wasteland. And then, beneath that primal cry, another sound emerges, the mechanical grinding of tank treads, the rhythmic crunch of 10,000 boots marching through snow. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division advances through the narrow forest road near Suomussalmi, a column stretching back 7 kilometers. They move with the confidence of overwhelming force, 350 tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces that can reduce concrete to dust. Behind them, supply trucks laden with ammunition, food, winter clothing for an army that believes it will sweep through Finland in a matter of weeks. Moscow has promised this will be over by February. The soldiers have been told they are liberating their Finnish brothers from capitalist oppression. Some believe it. Others simply follow orders. But all of them believe in their numbers. They do not yet know they are walking into a killing ground. Hidden in the trees, watching this steel serpent wind its way through their homeland, are 332 Finnish soldiers. They are dressed in white snow cloaks that render them nearly invisible against the landscape. Many of them are farmers, loggers, schoolteachers, men who knew these forests as children, who hunted elk and trapped fox in these same woods. They carry Mosin-Nagant rifles, some dating back to the previous century. Their average age is 38. They have no tanks. They have no air support. They possess exactly 4 anti-tank guns and enough ammunition for perhaps 3 hours of sustained combat. By every military calculation, they should retreat. By every rational measure, they should melt back into the forest and live to fight another defensive action elsewhere. But the order has been given by Colonel Jalmar Salasvuo, and the order is simple. Hold. Not for an hour. Not for a day. Hold until the enemy breaks or until there is no one left to hold. What happens in the next 72 hours will be studied in military academies for the next 8 decades. It will redefine modern warfare. It will demonstrate that numerical superiority means nothing without terrain knowledge, that technological advantage crumbles without supply lines, that 10,000 men can be stopped by 300 if those 300 understand one fundamental truth. They are not fighting for territory or ideology or political abstractions. They are fighting because this is their home, and there is nowhere left to retreat. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about mathematics, about cold, about what happens when desperation meets discipline, when the hunter becomes the hunted, when an army discovers that all their training has not prepared them for an enemy who knows every tree, every frozen stream, every hidden path through terrain that can kill as efficiently as any bullet. The temperature continues to drop. The Soviet column continues to advance. And in the trees, 332 men check their weapons one final time and prepare to teach an empire that some lines cannot be crossed, regardless of the cost. To understand this moment, we must step back 3 months. November 1939. The Soviet Union, having secured its western border through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, turns its attention northward. Finland, a nation of less than 4 million people, sits uncomfortably close to Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city. Stalin demands territorial concessions, move your border back, give us military bases, cede strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland. The Finns, having won their independence from Russia only 21 years earlier, refuse. They know what these concessions mean. They have seen what happened to the Baltic states, how cooperation becomes occupation, how compromise becomes annexation. On November 30th, Soviet bombers appear over Helsinki. By afternoon, Red Army units cross the Finnish border at 8 different points. The Soviet force numbers 425,640 men, 2,514 tanks, 3,880 aircraft. Finland can mobilize perhaps 180,000 soldiers, most of them reservists, farmers with basic military training. The world watches and prepares for a brief conflict. The British military attaché in Helsinki gives Finland 2 weeks before collapse. American newspapers write Finland's obituary before the first major battle has even been fought. But those observers are making calculations based on conventional warfare. They are measuring tank divisions and aircraft squadrons. They are counting artillery pieces and comparing industrial capacity. What they fail to account for is the most fundamental element of military success: motivation. The Red Army soldiers have been told they are liberating their Finnish brothers. The Finnish soldiers know they are protecting their homes. This difference between abstract political mission and concrete personal survival will prove to be the defining factor. And there is the cold. In December 1939, Scandinavia experiences one of the harshest winters in recorded history. Temperatures plunge to -50°C in some regions. The Gulf of Finland freezes solid. Lakes become highways of ice. And in the forests of eastern Finland, where the Soviet offensive plans its deepest penetration, the cold becomes a weapon more deadly than artillery. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division, the division now advancing through Suomussalmi, has been stationed in Ukraine. Its soldiers have winter clothing designed for the relatively mild Ukrainian winter. They have been issued long greatcoats that absorb moisture and freeze solid. Their tanks lack cold weather lubricants. Engines must be kept running constantly, or they will not restart. Their supply lines stretch hundreds of kilometers back into Russia, and those lines are about to be cut. The Finnish soldiers facing them are equipped for Arctic conditions. They understand that in this environment, mobility equals survival. They move on skis, traveling 15 kilometers through forest terrain in the time it takes Soviet columns to advance 3 kilometers on roads. They know how to build fires that produce no smoke. They know which snow is safe to traverse and which conceals swamps that will swallow a man in minutes. They have learned, through generations of living in this landscape, how to become part of it. This is the asymmetry that no military calculation can capture. The Soviets expected resistance. They expected battles. What they did not expect was to be fighting the land itself, to discover that the forest and the cold are allies of their enemy, that every advantage of numbers and technology becomes a vulnerability when supply trucks cannot reach the front and tanks cannot leave the roads. The trap is set with mathematical precision. Colonel Salasvuo has identified the kill zone weeks in advance. The Soviet 44th Division must advance along the Raate Road, a narrow track through dense forest. To either side, wilderness, frozen swamps, terrain impassable for vehicles. The Soviets can only move in column, stretched out, unable to deploy their numbers effectively. More critically, they must keep moving. Stop for more than a few hours in this cold without shelter, and men begin to freeze. Stop for a day, and the division begins to die not from bullets, but from hypothermia. The Finnish plan is called Motti tactics, the sausage cutter method. Instead of facing the Soviet column head-on, the Finnish soldiers infiltrate through the forest, moving parallel to the road, approaching from the flanks. They identify command posts, supply vehicles, communication units. They do not attack the entire column at once. They cut it into segments, isolating each piece, surrounding it, eliminating it while the rest of the column remains unaware. It requires extraordinary discipline. The Finnish soldiers must position themselves within meters of Soviet units without being detected. They must lie motionless in snow berms for hours, watching enemy soldiers pass, waiting for the precise moment to strike. They must resist the temptation to open fire prematurely, to give away their positions before the trap is complete. On the night of January 16th, the Finnish forward observers report that the Soviet column has entered the kill zone. The entire 44th Division, now consisting of approximately 10,000 men after previous engagements, is strung out along the Raate Road. The temperature has dropped to -43. Soviet soldiers huddle around fires, burning furniture they have scavenged from abandoned Finnish farms. Their vehicles are grouped in clusters, engines running to prevent freezing. The column has halted for the night, planning to resume advance at dawn. They will not see dawn as free men. At 0400 hours on January 17th, the Finnish attack begins not with a frontal assault but with surgical strikes on both ends of the column. Anti-tank teams, positioned in the forest, open fire on the lead and rear vehicles, blocking the road. Within minutes, the Soviet column is trapped, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to maneuver off the road. Confusion spreads faster than fire. Officers shout contradictory orders. Soldiers scramble for defensive positions, firing blindly into the dark forest, unable to identify where the attack is coming from. The Finnish soldiers do not charge. They remain hidden, selecting targets with deliberate care. A Soviet officer organizing his men is killed by a single shot from 200 meters. A machine gun crew attempting to establish a defensive position is eliminated by a white-clad assault team that appears from the snow, strikes, and vanishes before the Soviets can respond. Radio operators are targeted first, severing communication between different segments of the column. Supply trucks are set ablaze, their contents, food, ammunition, medical supplies, consumed by fire while Soviet soldiers watch helplessly. By dawn, the Soviet 44th Division has been cut into more than 20 isolated pockets. Each pocket is surrounded by Finnish ski troops who can approach and withdraw at will. The Soviets possess overwhelming firepower, but they cannot use it effectively. Firing artillery without clear targets is merely wasting ammunition. Deploying tanks without infantry support in forest terrain is suicide. The numerical advantage has been neutralized by terrain and tactics. And then there is the cold. Soviet soldiers, halted and unable to keep moving, begin to freeze. Those with inadequate winter clothing lose fingers and toes to frostbite within hours. Vehicles that have been shut down cannot be restarted. Their engines have seized. The fires that provided warmth during the night have consumed most available fuel. By midday on January 17th, the 44th Division is not merely trapped, it is dying. Inside the Soviet positions, the reality of the situation crystallizes slowly, then all at once. Major Dmitry Volkov, a composite figure representing the documented experiences of Soviet officers present at Raate Road, stands beside a frozen T-26 tank, staring at a map that has become meaningless. The division was supposed to link up with the 163rd Division 40 kilometers west. Radio contact was lost 12 hours ago. The supply convoy that was scheduled to arrive yesterday never appeared. And now his men are reporting Finnish soldiers in the trees to the north, south, east, seemingly everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He was told this would be a liberation. He was told the Finnish workers would welcome the Red Army as class allies, that the bourgeois Finnish government would collapse within days. Instead, he has lost a third of his battalion to an enemy he rarely sees, an enemy that strikes from impossible angles and then evaporates like smoke. The previous night, a Soviet supply position was overrun. The Finnish assault team, witnesses reported there were perhaps 15 men, killed 38 Soviet soldiers, destroyed 2 trucks, and disappeared back into the forest within 7 minutes. When reinforcements arrived, they found only bodies and burning vehicles. No Finnish casualties. No Finnish blood in the snow. It was as if ghosts had attacked them. This is what the Soviet soldiers expected. Organized battles, clear front lines, the weight of Soviet industrial might grinding down resistance through sheer attrition. This is what they are experiencing: invisible enemies, impossible cold, supply lines that have vanished, and the growing realization that they're not fighting an army, they're being hunted. The psychological impact is devastating. Soviet soldiers stop sleeping. Every snapping branch, every shift of wind through the pines, becomes a potential threat. Sentries fire at shadows, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions. The Finnish tactic of silence, of watching Soviet positions for hours without attacking, allowing paranoia to build, proves as effective as bullets. Men begin to crack. Some refuse to leave their vehicles. Others huddle in groups, finding false security in numbers, making themselves easier targets. And there is hunger. By the second day of encirclement, food supplies in the isolated pockets are running low. Soviet soldiers begin scavenging through destroyed vehicles, searching for anything edible. They melt snow for water, unaware that many of the snow deposits have been contaminated by corpses. Dysentery spreads. The combination of cold, hunger, and disease begins to kill more men than Finnish bullets. Major Volkov watches his command disintegrate. He has orders from division headquarters to break through the Finnish lines and continue the advance. But division headquarters has no concept of the reality on the ground. They do not understand that the Finnish lines are not static positions that can be broken. They are fluid, adaptive, everywhere and nowhere. They do not comprehend that his men are exhausted, freezing, running out of ammunition, that half his vehicles are immobilized, that morale has collapsed. He makes the decision that dozens of Soviet officers make during these 72 hours. He orders his men to abandon heavy equipment and attempt to break out on foot, to move cross-country through the forest, to escape the kill zone even if it means leaving behind tanks and artillery. It is a fatal mistake. The Soviet soldiers, dressed in long greatcoats, carrying heavy packs, attempting to move through meter-deep snow without skis, they might as well have been wearing signs advertising their positions. The Finnish ski troops track them effortlessly, harrying the columns, picking off stragglers, driving the Soviets deeper into the wilderness, where the cold will finish what bullets began. The Finnish soldiers fight with a focus that borders on mathematical precision. Private Alexei Korhonen, 34 years old, father of 3, a logger from a village 20 kilometers south, has not slept in 36 hours. His face is caked with frost where his breath has frozen against his scarf. His fingers are numb despite the wool gloves. But his mind is clear, focused on the simple equation of survival: eliminate the enemy before the enemy eliminates you. He moves through the forest with 4 other men, a Modi unit operating independently, searching for targets of opportunity. They communicate in whispers and hand signals. They have been together since the war began, have developed an instinctive understanding of each other's movements. They operate as a single organism, each man covering a sector, watching for threats, identifying opportunities. They come upon a Soviet supply position, 3 trucks, perhaps 20 soldiers gathered around a fire, cooking something in a pot. The smell of food drifts through the cold air. For a moment, Korhonen is aware of his own hunger. He has not eaten anything beyond frozen bread in 2 days. The Finnish supply situation is not much better than the Soviet one. But the Finnish soldiers are used to hunger. They grew up in a country where poverty was common, where making do with less was a survival skill learned in childhood. The attack is coordinated silently. 5 Finnish soldiers against 20 Soviets. The odds would seem to favor the Soviets. But the Finns have surprise, position, and most importantly, they are invisible in their white cloaks while the Soviets are silhouetted against the fire. The engagement lasts 40 seconds. When it is over, 15 Soviet soldiers are dead. The remainder have fled into the forest, and the Finnish soldiers are loading captured supplies onto a sled. Korhonen finds a loaf of black bread in one of the trucks, frozen solid. He breaks off a piece with his knife and puts it in his pocket, where his body heat will eventually thaw it enough to eat. There is also Soviet winter clothing, far inferior to Finnish equipment, but usable. Ammunition. Medical supplies. These will be dragged back to Finnish lines redistributed, used to continue the fight. There is no celebration of victory. No triumph in the killing. For the Finnish soldiers, this is not war as glory or ideology. This is pest control. The Soviets have invaded their country, and they are being exterminated with the same methodical efficiency a farmer uses to clear rats from a grain store. It is necessary work. Unpleasant work. But it must be done. What the Finnish soldiers feel, those who later document their experiences in letters and memoirs, is not hatred but a grim determination. They do not see the Soviet soldiers as evil. They see them as threats to be neutralized. The individual Soviet soldier, cold and scared and far from home, might evoke sympathy in other circumstances. But these are not other circumstances. The Soviets chose to invade. They chose to bring war to Finnish soil. And now they are learning that choices have consequences. Korhonen and his unit move on, deeper into the kill zone, searching for the next target. Behind them, the bodies of the Soviet soldiers begin to freeze, becoming part of the landscape, indistinguishable from fallen logs after the next snowfall. The forest consumes everything. The aftermath of Raate Road reverberates far beyond the immediate battlefield. In Moscow, Stalin receives the reports with cold fury. The 44th Division's destruction is an embarrassment that cannot be explained away. He orders mass purges of the military commanders responsible, executing officers who have already been killed in Finland, seeking scapegoats for a strategic failure that was baked into the original plan. The assumption that Finland would collapse quickly, that the Finnish people would not fight, that Soviet industrial superiority would compensate for tactical incompetence. These assumptions are revealed as delusions, but the Soviet leadership cannot admit this. Instead, they blame individuals, they blame sabotage, they blame anything except their own miscalculation. In Helsinki, the victory at Raate Road provides a desperately needed morale boost. The Finnish government has been seeking international support, trying to convince Britain, France, and the United States to intervene. The destruction of the 44th Division demonstrates that Finland is not merely resisting, it is winning battles. It suggests that with material support, Finland might actually survive. The international community begins to pay attention. Aid arrives: aircraft from Britain, volunteers from Sweden, weapons purchased with loans from America. It is not enough to change the strategic picture, but it is enough to sustain the fight. And in the forests of eastern Finland, the Finnish soldiers who participated in the battle return to their positions and prepare for the next engagement. They do not celebrate. They do not boast. They understand that this war is far from over, that the Soviets will adapt, will bring overwhelming force to bear, will eventually achieve their objectives through sheer persistence. But they also understand that they have proven something fundamental, that courage and knowledge of terrain can triumph over technology and numbers, that a small nation can make invasion so costly that even a great power will hesitate. Private Korhonen, sitting in a bunker 40 kilometers from Raate Road, finally eats the piece of Soviet bread he took from the supply truck. It is still half-frozen, tastes of nothing, provides minimal nutrition. But it is food, and in this war, food is survival. He thinks about his family, evacuated to relatives in western Finland, beyond the range of Soviet artillery. He wonders if they have enough to eat, if his children are warm, if they understand why their father is not with them. He has received no letters in 3 weeks. The mail service has collapsed under the demands of war. He does not think of himself as a hero. He does not imagine that what he has done will be remembered or studied or commemorated. He is simply doing what must be done, what any man would do when his home is threatened. The Finnish concept of Sisu, that untranslatable combination of determination, resilience, and stubborn refusal to surrender even in hopeless circumstances, is not something the Finnish soldiers talk about. It is simply how they live, how they approach every challenge, from harsh winters to failed harvests to invading armies. This is the profound difference between the Finnish and Soviet soldiers. The Finns are fighting for something concrete, immediate, personal. The Soviets are fighting for an abstraction, for political objectives decided in distant Moscow by leaders who will never see these frozen forests or sleep in these trenches. This difference in motivation explains the disparity in performance far more than any comparison of equipment or training. The Winter War will continue until March 13, 1940, when Finland, exhausted and running out of ammunition, signs the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland cedes the territory Stalin originally demanded and more. The Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viipuri, strategic islands, all are transferred to Soviet control. By the terms of the treaty, Finland loses. The Soviet Union achieves its territorial objectives. Stalin's armies occupy the lands they set out to conquer. But the cost is staggering. Soviet casualties are estimated at 126,875 dead, 264,908 wounded, 5,600 captured. The Finns lose 25,904 dead, 43,557 wounded. The kill ratio is nearly 5-1 in favor of the Finns. The Soviet Union, with its overwhelming advantages in men and material, has been bled white by a nation of less than 4 million people. The international community takes note. The Soviet military, despite its size, is poorly led, poorly trained, inadequately prepared for winter warfare. This perception will have enormous consequences 18 months later when Nazi Germany, observing Soviet weakness, decides to launch Operation Barbarossa. The Finnish soldiers who fought at Raate Road and in dozens of similar engagements do not consider themselves victorious. They have lost territory. They have buried friends. They have seen their country ravaged. But they have also demonstrated something that will define Finnish identity for generations, that they are not victims, not pawns to be moved by great powers, not a people who will submit to invasion without exacting a terrible price. The story of the 332 Finnish soldiers who held the line against 10,000 Soviet troops becomes legend, but like all legends, it simplifies a complex reality. Those 332 men were not alone. They were supported by thousands of other Finnish soldiers in adjacent positions, by civilian resistance, by a national determination to resist that transcended military calculations. They were aided by terrain, by weather, by Soviet incompetence. They were fighting with the accumulated knowledge of generations of living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But strip away the context, and the core truth remains: 332 men held a position against an enemy force 30 times their size for 3 days, and when those 3 days were over, the enemy force had been destroyed. By any measure, this should not have been possible. That it happened at all is testimony to what humans are capable of when they are fighting not for ideology or conquest, but for the right to exist in their own homeland. 72 years later, in 2012, a Finnish historian walks the Raate Road, now paved and peaceful. The forest has reclaimed much of the battlefield. Where tanks once burned, trees now grow. Where men froze to death, mushrooms push through the moss in autumn. The physical scars of war have healed. But if you know where to look, and the historian knows, you can still find traces. A rusted tank tread, half buried in the undergrowth. Shell casings, oxidized and fragile. Dog tags, the inscriptions worn away by decades of rain and snow. The historian is collecting oral histories from the last surviving veterans of the Winter War. They are in their 90s now, these men who once fought in the frozen forests. Their memories are fragmentary, unreliable in details, but crystalline in emotion. They remember the cold with a visceral intensity that time has not diminished. They remember the fear, not of dying but of failing, of allowing the enemy to break through, of betraying the trust of the civilians depending on them. And they remember the silence, the eerie quiet of snow-covered forests broken only by distant gunfire and the sound of their own breathing. One veteran, asked what he wants people to understand about the Winter War, thinks for a long moment. Then he says, "We were not heroes. We were scared. We were cold. We wanted to go home. But we understood that if we did not hold the line, there would be no home to go back to. So we held." It was not complicated. It was simple survival. This is the truth that military historians sometimes miss when analyzing Raate Road and similar engagements. Tactics and terrain mattered, but at the core, the Finnish soldiers won because they had no choice but to win. Retreat meant the loss of their country. Surrender meant occupation. Victory, no matter how unlikely, was the only acceptable outcome. This clarity of purpose, this absolute understanding of what was at stake, is what transformed farmers and loggers into warriors capable of defeating a force 30 times their size. The symbolic meaning of Raate Road extends beyond Finnish history. It becomes a touchstone for every small nation facing an existential threat, for every underdog confronting overwhelming odds. It demonstrates that military power, however vast, has limits. That will and knowledge can compensate for material deficiency. That the home field advantage is real and significant. That sometimes, against all rational calculation, 300 can stand against 10,000 and prevail. The recurring image throughout this story, the Soviet supply truck, burning in the snow, represents the limits of industrial warfare. The Soviet Union could produce trucks by the thousands, could flood the battlefield with material, could replace losses in a war of attrition. But none of that mattered if they could not protect those supply lines, could not adapt to terrain and weather, could not motivate their soldiers to fight with the same desperate intensity as the enemy they faced. In the end, the Winter War teaches a lesson that empires continually forget and small nations must constantly remember: that conquest is easy, occupation is hard, and forcing a determined people to submit is nearly impossible. The Soviet Union won the territorial concessions it demanded, but it paid a price so disproportionate that Stalin, before his death, reportedly expressed regret about the decision to invade Finland. The territorial gains were not worth the blood spilled, the international humiliation, the exposure of Soviet military weakness. The epilogue to this story is written not in history books but in the consciousness of a nation. Modern Finland, prosperous and peaceful, builds its identity in part on the memory of the Winter War. The monuments scattered across the country, simple stone markers in forest clearings, museums in converted bunkers, serve as reminders of what previous generations endured. Finnish schoolchildren study Raate Road, not as military history but as moral instruction. This is what we did when our existence was threatened. This is the price we were willing to pay. This is why we are still here. The lesson extends beyond nationalism. It speaks to the universal human capacity for resilience, for finding strength in desperate circumstances, for doing what seems impossible because the alternative is unacceptable. The 332 Finnish soldiers at Raate Road did not believe they could defeat 10,000 Soviet troops. But they believed they had to try, and in trying, they discovered reserves of capability they did not know they possessed. This is the final truth of Raate Road: that human potential is revealed not in comfort but in crisis, that we discover what we are capable of only when we are tested beyond our perceived limits, that sometimes the only way to survive is to attempt the impossible and somehow, against all odds, succeed. The frozen forests of eastern Finland, silent now except for wind and wildlife, hold within their soil the bones of men who learned this truth the hard way. Soviet soldiers who expected an easy victory and found instead a frozen hell. Finnish soldiers who expected to die and instead survived to tell the story. The land remembers what the living forget: that war is not glorious, that victory is measured in suffering averted rather than glory achieved, that the true heroes are not those who seek battle but those who, when battle comes to them, stand firm and refuse to yield. 332 men held the line against 10,000. The mathematics should not have worked. But mathematics does not account for will, for knowledge, for the determination of people fighting for their homes. The numbers said they would lose. History says they won. And in that contradiction lies a truth more powerful than any calculation: that sometimes, when everything is at stake, the impossible becomes possible, and 300 can indeed hold back 10,000. The snow falls on Raate Road, as it has every winter for 80 years, covering the land in white silence, erasing all traces of what happened here, until the only record that remains is memory and the stubborn fact that Finland still exists, free and independent, because 332 men decided that some lines, once drawn, can never be crossed.